This is the Poison Terminator podcast. My name is Carlo Deolim. Today we're going to talk about how safe gardening practices can help reduce your exposure to chemicals. My guest today is Hannah Shayler. Hannah has worked for the Cornell Waste Management Institute since 2008 after completing a master's degree in natural resources at Cornell University and a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from Connecticut College. As an extension associate with Cornell Waste Management Institute, Hannah leads the Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities program and related efforts to address concerns about contaminants in the soils of gardens, schools, residential properties, and other community spaces through research and outreach that supports healthy gardening practices. Welcome to the show, Hannah.
Thank you, Carlo. Happy to be here.
The first question I want to ask you is, should we be alarmed about the presence of chemicals in our gardens?
I think the best way to answer that is to say that we don't need to be alarmed, but we should be aware. The good thing about all of this is that the science and our work with gardeners and seeing all the things that they're doing shows us that there are things that people can do. So if we know that there's a problem, we can take steps to make it better.
Are there acceptable levels for contaminants in soil?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a tricky question. Our Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities program works primarily with contaminants like lead and other heavy metals. And it's important to remember that metals are chemical elements that occur naturally in our environment. So they're there in our soils, they're there around us, but human activities sometimes change the concentrations in which we find them in our soils and other places in our environment. So, we really want to think about how our activities can make the environment as safe and healthy for things like growing food and for ways that we can interact with them.
Are there chemicals in soils at low level that can cause health effects?
Yeah, so lead is a big one to pay attention to. Lead is really common in our environment because of several things that humans have done over the years. We've taken lead from its spot where it exists naturally in the soils and is part of just the Earth's chemistry, and we put it in things like leaded paints and leaded gasoline and in certain pesticides. So as a result of that, we've moved it all around, and we see higher levels of lead than what we would expect in undisturbed areas because we've used all of these products, the leaded paint, the leaded gasoline. So places where we see more cars and more buildings and more people, we may see higher levels of contamination. And lead especially is really important to be careful of because it is a potent neurotoxin that can really cause harm, especially to young children.
What are other chemicals as toxic as lead that I can find in a soil?
What we see in soil really depends a lot on the history of the site. And so we recommend that people do a little detective work to try to figure out what might have happened. And there are sometimes some chemicals that are there for the same reasons as lead. For example, there's a pesticide that was used in certain areas that had lead and arsenic. But so it really depends what happened on the site, what you're going to find there. But there are other chemicals that we can find in our soils that can be toxic to either people or to plants. So other heavy metals, and also sometimes things like organic pesticides or other products that have resulted from human activities.
What are some of the effects that these substances can have on our health?
Yeah, it really depends on the specific chemical. Again, lead is problematic because of its effects on especially the developing nervous systems of young kids. Some of these chemicals are potentially carcinogenic, meaning that under certain conditions, when exposed a lot over many years, they might increase our risk of developing certain cancers. But again, the specific health issues really depend on which chemical we're talking about and how people are interacting with their environment.
How can I know that the soil of my garden is contaminated by chemicals?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. For certain types of chemicals, you might be able to have some clues by looking at your plants. Certain chemicals may not be toxic to people, but they might not be good for the plants. So you might see that if your plants are having a hard time growing. Things like nickel, zinc, or copper, for example, are not really a problem for human health at levels that we tend to see them in the soils, but they might cause problems for plants. Unfortunately, many of the chemicals like lead that are most toxic to humans, we can't tell that they're there just by looking at the soils or the plants. So the best thing really to do is to, again, kind of pretend that you're a detective and try to get some clues about what's happening on a property. Might there be old paint that's peeling off of a building and might be getting into the soil? Are you really close to a busy roadway? Do you see something in your soil that just doesn't look quite right? Certain types of organic contaminants, if you smell something that smells like a chemical or see something oily, that might be a sign that you should investigate further. And soil testing is one way that you can do that. You can collect soil samples and send them off to a lab, and that's really the way to know for sure whether levels of lead or another contaminant are elevated in your soils.
When do you think it's absolutely necessary to test your soil?
Well, if you're starting a new garden, or if you have young kids that are playing outside in your yard or in your community garden or any place where there's soil, it's really good to think about the health of that soil and whether it might need some help. And in some cases, it makes sense to collect soil samples and to spend the money on getting some good information to inform your decision making and to try to come up with the best plan for using that site. In other cases, you might have a really strong feeling that the soil is not looking that great, and maybe you're pretty sure that there's lead there because there's an older painted structure. And in that case, sometimes it makes sense to just cover up the existing soil and build some raised beds and bring in clean materials and grow in that instead. So it can be a trade-off about whether you want to put your resources into testing and getting some results, or if you want to just kind of assume that maybe the soil isn't the best to grow in and instead focus on healthy gardening practices.
If I get a test result that my garden has a lot of chemicals at high level, is my garden not usable? Are there ways to clean up the soil of my garden?
Yeah, unfortunately for lead, there is not an easy way to clean up the soil that's already there. Adding compost does help a lot. It can dilute the contaminants just because you're adding more material, and it also can help make lead and some other metals less likely to be in a form that can be taken up by the plants. So if you have an existing garden, you can definitely add compost, and depending on the levels of lead or other chemicals that you found, that might help, and over time you can improve things. In some cases, you might want to think about which crops you're planting there instead. Certain types of crops, like root crops and leafy greens, are more likely to be affected by contaminants in the soil because they're growing either right in the soil, or leafy crops are more prone to having contaminant particles on their surfaces, and they can be hard to wash off sometimes. Whereas fruiting crops, any sort of fruit or vegetable fruit, are much less likely to have contaminants in the edible part. So, we can take some small steps to fix soil if there's already a problem. The better scenario, of course, is if we can be growing in the first place in material that we are confident is not contaminated.
I noticed that some people remove chemicals from their vegetables and fruits with vinegar or with a little bit of dishwater soap and water. Does that really work?
Our research group actually just did some experiments with that this past growing season, and it really seems to come down to the fact that washing your vegetables is really important. We saw a big difference between washing and not washing, but the specific method may not be all that important. So our recommendations so far are whatever washing method works for you, as long as you're washing your vegetables thoroughly, then that's a really important step you can take.
Are there any plants that we could put in our garden to remove the presence of contaminants in the air and in the soil?
Unfortunately, not for lead. We wish that there was a magic plant that we could plant in our soils to take up all the lead and get it out of there. And there's been a lot of work that's gone into looking at that. And it's good news that our plants don't take up a lot of lead. That's good news for the plants that we eat. But that does mean that bioremediation, or having a plant take up chemicals from the soil, is not a good solution for lead, because the plants just aren't able to do that. For certain other types of chemicals, that can be more of an option. For example, for arsenic, there are certain plant species that can help to take up some of that metal into the plant tissue. However, then you have to figure out what to do with those plants that now have more metals in them. So generally, for the average gardener, planting things to help improve their soils is not the best solution. There are some other things that are more effective.
I read that pesticides are bad for our health. Do I need to use alternative products?
There are different schools of thought on that, and that's a little outside of my own area of expertise, but it's certainly, in general, it's really important to think about what you're putting into your garden. And, everything from the soil to the building materials that you might be using for raised beds, to the compost that you might be putting in, and of course any chemicals that you're considering applying to your plants, you just want to consider carefully whether it's necessary for your situation and trying to consider the health of people and of plants when you're making a decision. And there's certainly cases where pesticides are useful and important, but yeah, the specific products really depend on your situation and what you're trying to accomplish.
What's your advice for people who want to sensitize their friends and family about soil health?
One thing that is really important for our program to emphasize is that it can get a little concerning to be hearing about risks and health effects, and we really want people to keep in mind the many benefits of gardening. And it's a way to grow fresh, healthy food, to connect with families and communities and across generations. So we want to support that, and we really want people to remember that although it's important to think about the potential for contaminants in their soils, there are steps they can take. On our project website at blogs.cornell.edu/healthy soils, we have resources focused on what gardeners can do and best practices for healthy gardening. And we really want people to feel like they have the tools to take proactive steps so that they can be aware of the concerns but then know exactly what they can do rather than just being worried about it. Because we don't want people to stop gardening.
Now I want to ask you a question out of curiosity. Can you tell us why did you choose to do research in soil science?
Sure. My background is in environmental sciences and natural resources more broadly. So it's always been really interesting to me to learn more about how humans are interacting with our environment and how we're affecting our environment, and also to support the health of our planet and of our communities. And this project was a really good fit. Soils are so important for growing food and also just as a touchstone for support of our communities. And by troubleshooting these concerns about soil contaminants and helping to develop science-based strategies that people can take in their own gardens, I feel that we're really supporting really positive aspects of our communities.
Thank you, Anna, for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
And that's all for this week. I'll be back for another episode of The Poison Terminator. Have a great day.